Hello, and welcome back, dear listeners, to another quiet evening with mystery and murder. Tonight, we travel to a grand English estate where snow has fallen soft and thick over a sprawling hedge maze, the kind of maze built for laughter, for games, for young lovers to lose themselves in on a winter afternoon. But this year, the snow hides something far darker. A guest is found lifeless within its frozen walls. A single wound, the only mark upon an otherwise peaceful scene. And around the body, footprints, dozens of them, crossing, doubling back, leading everywhere and nowhere at once, as though the snow itself were lying. Into this confusion steps a small grey-haired woman with sharp eyes and a gentle voice. Miss Jane Marple. She does not run, she does not shout, she simply watches. So settle in, pour something warm, and let us walk together into the maze. If you enjoy these quiet evenings of mystery, do stay a while longer. There's always another puzzle waiting. Now, let us begin. The Gathering. The village of Little Hawksmere lay quiet under its December blanket, smoke curling from chimneys, the church bells having rung their last for evensong some hours before. It was the kind of village where nothing much happened, and where, consequently, everyone noticed everything. Miss Jane Marple sat in the back of Mr. Rutherford's hired car, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap, watching the hedgerows slip by, frosted white and glittering faintly under the carriage lamps. She was bound for Ashcombe Hall, the grand old house belonging to Colonel Henry Ashcombe, where she had been invited, rather to her own surprise, to spend the Christmas week. "Dreadful weather for travelling, Miss Marple," the driver remarked, glancing at her in the mirror. "Snow's coming down thick over the downs." "Yes," she said mildly, "though I find snow rather softens the world, don't you think? Makes everything look gentler than it perhaps is." The driver chuckled, not quite understanding her, and said nothing further. Ashcombe Hall, when it came into view, was every inch the picture of festive grandeur. Tall, mullioned windows glowing amber against the dusk, holly wreaths upon the great oak door, and beyond the house, just visible in the fading light, the dark green shape of the famous yew maze, its hedges dusted white, like a sleeping creature curled beneath the snow. Miss Marple had heard of the Ashcombe maze before, of course. It was something of a local curiosity, planted some 60 years past by the Colonel's grandfather, who had fancied himself a man of whimsy and had designed it with such cunning that more than one guest, over the decades, had been obliged to call out for rescue from its depths. The Colonel was rather proud of it, in the way that men are proud of things they did not themselves create. She was greeted at the door by Pratt, the elderly butler, whose knees, she noted, troubled him rather more this winter than the last, and who walked with the particular stiffness of a man determined not to admit it. "Miss Marple, the Colonel is expecting you in the drawing-room, along with the other guests." "Thank you, Pratt. I do hope I'm not too dreadfully late." "Not at all, miss. Mrs. Carmody only just arrived herself, not 20 minutes past." The drawing-room, when Miss Marple entered it, was warm with firelight and the low murmur of polite conversation. Colonel Ashcombe rose at once to greet her. A broad, ruddy-faced man in his 60s, his moustache white and well-groomed, his manner hearty in the way of men who have spent a lifetime being obeyed without much effort. "Miss Marple! Delighted! Quite delighted! Letitia speaks so highly of you, says you're the cleverest woman in 3 counties. He laughed, a touch too loudly, and gestured her toward the fire. "Come, come, warm yourself. Let me make the introductions." It was Letitia Ashcombe, the Colonel's niece, who had in fact arranged the invitation, a thoughtful, quietly observant young woman of perhaps 30, who had once, some years before, been a pupil of Miss Marple's late friend, and had remained fond of her ever since. She came forward now, with real warmth, pressing Miss Marple's hand. "I'm so glad you came. I did worry the roads might be impossible." "Not at all, my dear. A little snow never stopped an old woman with somewhere pleasant to go." The gathering, Miss Marple observed, for she could not help but observe, it was rather in her nature, like breathing, numbered perhaps 9 in all, counting the Colonel and his niece. There was Mrs. Eleanor Carmody, a widow of striking elegance, whose dark hair was threaded with silver and whose smile, Miss Marple noted, did not quite reach her eyes. She sat near the fire with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being looked at, though there was, underneath it, something watchful, the look of a woman counting the exits in a room without seeming to. Beside her sat her brother, Mr. Gerald Finch, a thin, nervous man with ink-stained fingers and the apologetic stoop of a man who had spent his life being told he was not quite clever enough by people less clever than himself. He worked, Miss Marple gathered from the conversation, in some capacity connected with the family's finances, though precisely what capacity, no one seemed eager to specify. Then there was Major Thomas Reeve, a guest of the Colonel's from his army days, loud and florid, fond of his brandy, and fonder still of stories in which he himself emerged the hero. He had, Miss Marple suspected within the first 5 minutes of his acquaintance, told the same 3 anecdotes so many times that he had quite forgotten whether they were entirely true. Young Captain Davies, David Davies, as he insisted on being called, with the faint embarrassment of a man who had never forgiven his parents for the joke of his name, sat somewhat apart, near the window, his attention drifting often toward Letitia Ashcombe, in a manner he clearly believed to be subtle, and clearly was not. And there, in the corner, quieter than the rest, was Mr. Julian Hartwell, a slim, fair young man, beautifully dressed, who smiled readily and said little of substance, and whom Miss Marple found herself watching rather more closely than the others, though she could not, at first, have said why. Lastly, there was the victim-to-be, though of course no one in that warm and firelit room could have known it, Mr. Rupert Vane. He arrived a little after Miss Marple herself, shaking snow from his coat with a careless laugh, full of easy charm, and the particular confidence of a man who has never once doubted his own welcome anywhere. He was perhaps 40, handsome in a worn sort of way, with the restless eyes of someone who grew bored quickly and made others pay for it. "Ah, the whole house party assembled," he said, helping himself to a glass of sherry without waiting to be offered one. "How cozy, how festive. I do hope someone's arranged something more entertaining than charades." "There's the maze, of course," said Letitia quietly. "Uncle's very proud of it. Perhaps tomorrow, if the snow allows." "The maze!" Vane's eyes lit with sudden interest. "Now that I should like to see. Mazes are rather like people, don't you find, Colonel? All those false turnings, dead ends, blind corners, and somewhere in the middle, if you're patient enough, the truth." There was a brief silence at that, the sort of silence that comes not from offense exactly, but from something having landed rather too near the bone. Miss Marple, sipping her sherry, noticed that Mrs. Carmody's hand had tightened, just slightly, upon the arm of her chair, and that Gerald Finch had not looked up from the fire at all. "Quite so, the Colonel said heartily, breaking the silence with the ease of long practice. "Well, dinner in an hour, I should think. Pratt will show everyone up." As the party began to disperse toward their rooms, Miss Marple lingered a moment by the window, looking out at the maze below, its hedges black-green under the frosted moonlight, the first fresh snow of the evening just beginning to fall. A pretty thing, she thought, a very pretty thing indeed. And yet there was something in the stillness of it, in the way its shadowed paths curved out of sight, promising and concealing in equal measure, that put her, not unpleasantly, in mind of a great many things she had seen before, in gardens rather like this one, where pleasant people gathered for pleasant reasons, and where, beneath the pleasantness, something else entirely was quietly taking shape. She turned from the window at last, smiling faintly to herself, and went up to dress for dinner. Fresh snow, fresh troubled dinner. That evening had been, on the surface, a pleasant enough affair. Roast goose, good claret, and the Colonel's hearty insistence on toasting absent friends and present company, not once but twice. And yet Miss Marple, who had learned long ago that dinner tables revealed a great deal more than dining rooms intended, had found herself quietly cataloguing a number of small, curious things. She had noticed, for instance, that Rupert Vane had spent a remarkable portion of the meal directing his charm, and his rather pointed remarks, toward Mrs. Carmody, who bore it with the brittle composure of a woman holding her temper by main force. She had noticed, too, that Gerald Finch had drunk rather more wine than a nervous man ought, and had twice begun to speak, and twice thought better of it. And she had noticed that Julian Hartwell, for all his easy smiles, had watched Vane across the table with an expression that was, just for a moment, entirely without warmth. But these were, after all, only impressions, the sort of thing one noticed at any dinner party, among any group of people thrown together for a week of forced conviviality. Miss Marple had gone up to bed that night, thinking no more of it than she might think of a slightly sour note in an otherwise agreeable piece of music. She woke, therefore, the following morning with no particular sense of foreboding, only the ordinary, pleasant anticipation of a winter's day and the soft blue light of new snow filtering through her curtains. It was Pratt's voice, raised and unsteady in a manner quite unlike himself, that told her something was badly wrong. She came down to find the front hall in a state of considerable disorder. Letitia stood very pale by the door, a coat thrown hastily over her nightdress. The Colonel, still in his dressing gown, was shouting something about the telephone, and Captain Davies, his boots half-laced, was pulling on a coat with the grim haste of a man who has just been given very bad news indeed. "What has happened?" Miss Marple asked, of no one in particular, though it was Letitia who answered, her voice thin and shaking. "It's Mr. Vane. One of the gardener's boys found him. In the maze. Miss Marple, he's dead. He's been stabbed." There was, for a long moment, an entirely natural silence. The silence of a household, absorbing a horror it had not the vocabulary for. Then the Colonel was shouting again for someone to ring the police at Market Hawksmere, and Davies was pushing past toward the garden door, and Mrs. Carmody appeared at the top of the stairs in her wrap, her face the colour of the snow outside, asking in a voice not quite her own, what on earth was happening. Miss Marple, with the calm of long habit, fetched her coat. The garden, when she reached it, was breathtaking in its ordinary winter beauty. 6 inches of fresh, untouched snow lying soft over the lawns, the box hedges rounded into white humps, the sky above pale and clean as washed linen. It seemed, to Miss Marple's eye, almost obscene that such loveliness should be the setting for what lay within the maze. The entrance to the maze stood between 2 tall stone pillars, snow already beginning to melt slightly where Pratt and the gardener's boy had trampled it in their first frightened approach. Beyond, the hedges rose dark and dense, 8 feet high in places, their narrow paths winding away into a confusion of green-black walls. And there, in the paths, were the footprints. Miss Marple stood at the entrance for a long moment before she went in, simply looking, for she had found, over a great many years, that the first look at a thing was very often the most honest one, before the mind began arranging what it saw into convenient shapes. The footprints were everywhere. They crossed and recrossed the white paths in a bewildering tangle, coming, going, doubling back upon themselves, branching off into the maze's many false turnings. Some were deep and clear, as of a man walking with purpose, others shallow and scuffed, as though someone had hesitated, or turned, or stood still a long while in one spot before moving on. It was, Miss Marple thought, very much like looking at a sentence written in a language one almost, but not quite, understood. "Don't go further in, Miss Marple, if you don't mind," came a voice. Inspector Crabbe, summoned with admirable speed from the village, a solid, unhurried man with the patient face of someone who had learned not to be rushed by other people's panic. "We'll want the photographs taken before more boots go trampling about." "Of course, Inspector. Very wise." She could see, even from the entrance, the shape of poor Mr. Vane lying some way along the central path, half on his side, one arm flung out, his evening coat, for he had not, it seemed, returned to his room before going out again, dark, with something that was not snow. A single wound, Crabbe's sergeant murmured to him, in the low voice men use over the dead. Straight to the heart, very precise, very sure. Not a struggle by the look of things. Not much of one at any rate. Killed sometime in the night, Crabbe said, half to himself, half to Miss Marple, for he had known her some years now, from a previous unpleasantness in the village, and had learned to value her presence rather than resent it. Snow stopped falling round about 2, the constable tells me, and there's been none since. So whatever footprints were made after that time, they're all we've got. And a great many of them there are, Miss Marple murmured. Too many if you ask me. Look at it. Crabbe gestured at the maze's tangled paths. Half a dozen people could have walked through here last night, and we'd never tell one set from another, not in this muddle. Whoever did this either had a great many accomplices, Miss Marple, or, said Miss Marple thoughtfully. They were rather clever about how they walked. Crabbe glanced at her sharply, but said nothing further on the matter, for the police photographer had arrived, stamping his feet against the cold, and there was the business of the body to attend to. Miss Marple withdrew quietly to the maze's entrance, where the house party had begun to gather, despite the cold, drawn by that terrible human curiosity that draws people toward exactly the things they most wish they had not seen. She watched their faces rather than the maze itself. The colonel looked, more than anything, bewildered, a man for whom murder was a thing that happened in newspapers, to other people's house parties. Letitia stood very still and very white, her hands pressed together, and Miss Marple noted, with the part of her mind that never quite stopped noting things, that the girl's eyes kept returning, almost against her will, to Julian Hartwell, who stood a little apart, his usual easy smile entirely absent, his face unreadable. Mrs. Carmody had not come down at all, it seemed, or had come down and gone up again. Gerald Finch stood beside Major Reeve, looking very ill indeed, his ink-stained fingers trembling visibly even in the cold, and the Major, for once, was entirely silent, which Miss Marple thought perhaps the most telling thing of all. "A bad business," murmured a voice at her elbow. It was Captain Davies, his breath fogging in the cold air. Vane wasn't, I mean to say, one didn't like him precisely. But murder, here, it seems hardly believable. "Murder very often does, Captain Davies," Miss Marple said gently, "right up until the moment it becomes entirely believable indeed." He looked at her, faintly puzzled, but she said no more, only turned her gaze back toward the maze, where Inspector Crabbe's men were beginning, with great care, to photograph and measure that vast, bewildering confusion of footprints in the snow, a confusion which seemed, to every other eye watching, like nothing so much as chaos. But Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime watching village knitting circles unravel their secrets, one dropped stitch at a time, found herself thinking that chaos, very often, was simply order that had not yet been properly read. She drew her coat a little closer against the cold, and settled in to watch. The footprints puzzle. By mid-morning, the snow had stopped entirely, and a thin, watery sun had emerged to lay pale light across the gardens of Ashcombe Hall. Light enough, at least, for Inspector Crabbe's men to complete their photographs and their careful, methodical measurements of every footprint that marred the white paths of the maze. The body of Mr. Rupert Vane had been removed an hour before, with as much dignity as the circumstances allowed, and the house party had been gathered, somewhat to their collective discomfort, into the morning room, where a fire had been lit, and where Inspector Crabbe now stood with his notebook, looking, Miss Marple thought, like a man who had a great many questions and very little confidence that the answers would make matters any clearer. "I'll want to speak to each of you in turn," he said, "but first, if you'll permit me, I should like to understand the lay of the land, so to speak. The maze. Who here knows it well?" It was the colonel who answered, settling into his chair with the air of a man grateful for something practical to discuss. "I should think I know it best, Inspector. Built by my grandfather, you understand. 60 years ago now, perhaps more. Designed it himself, with a fellow from Hampton Court, or so the story goes. Damnably clever thing. Took me the better part of a summer to learn it properly, as a boy. And the rest of you?" There was a general murmur of partial familiarity. Letitia knew it well, having grown up at the Hall. Major Reeve claimed, with his usual confidence, to have mastered it years ago on a previous visit, though Miss Marple privately doubted his memory was quite so reliable as his manner suggested. The others admitted to knowing only the general shape of it, the central clearing with its sundial, the few main paths, but not the maze's more obscure branches and dead ends. "Could you draw it, Colonel? From memory?" "I could indeed." The Colonel rose, and at Crabbe's direction, sketched upon a sheet of paper a rough plan of the maze's winding paths, a complicated thing, full of false turns and loops, with a single central clearing at its heart. And, Miss Marple noted with interest, only two means of entry: the main entrance by which she herself had come that morning, and a smaller, lesser-used gate on the maze's eastern side, opening onto the kitchen gardens. "Now then," Crabbe said, studying the sketch with the careful frown of a man unused to puzzles of this particular shape. "The body was found here." He tapped a spot, perhaps 2/3 of the way toward the central clearing. "And the footprints, as you'll have gathered, are spread across nearly the whole of the maze, coming from both entrances by the look of it, crisscrossing every which way. Now, what I want to know is this. Is there any sense to be made of that at all, or is it simply confusion?" It was a fair question, and one that Miss Marple herself had been turning over since first light. She said nothing, however, only sat a little apart with her knitting, for she had brought it down with her, as was her habit, finding that her hands occupied themselves rather more usefully when busy, leaving her mind free to wander where it would, and listened. "I should think," said Julian Hartwell slowly, from his place near the window, "that whoever did it must have walked about a good deal, to confuse the trail, doubled back, gone round in circles. That sort of thing isn't difficult, surely, in a maze." "And how would you know that, Mr. Hartwell?" Crabbe asked, not unkindly but with the particular alertness of a policeman noting a volunteered opinion. Hartwell's smile flickered, briefly uncertain. "I don't know it, Inspector. I merely imagine it would be the obvious thing to do, if one wished to muddy the waters." "Obvious to some, perhaps," murmured Miss Marple, so quietly that only Letitia, seated nearest her, seemed to hear it at all. The questioning continued for some time, where each guest had been the night before, when they had retired, whether they had heard anything unusual. The answers were, as such answers generally are, a patchwork of half-certainties. Mrs. Carmody, pale and composed once more, said she had retired early, directly after the others, and heard nothing until Pratt's cry that morning. Gerald Finch, his hands still unsteady, said much the same, though he stumbled twice over the simple matter of what time he had gone up, correcting himself in a manner that struck Miss Marple as more nervous than dishonest. Though with Mr. Finch, she reflected, it was not always easy to tell the two apart. Major Reeve had, by his own account, sat up rather late with a brandy in the library, alone, and had seen no one. Captain Davies had likewise retired early, though he coloured slightly when asked whether he had gone directly to his room, a fact Miss Marple filed away with quiet interest, though she suspected its explanation had rather more to do with Letitia Ashcombe than with murder. When at last the questioning was done, and Crabbe had gone out again to confer with his sergeant over the photographs, Miss Marple rose, set aside her knitting, and asked Letitia, very quietly, whether she might be permitted to walk in the garden a while. "Of course, though, Miss Marple, surely you don't mean to go into the maze?" "Not into it, my dear. Merely to look at it. An old woman's curiosity, nothing more." She found Inspector Crabbe at the maze's entrance, frowning over the photographs his men had developed in haste in the gardener's shed, and he greeted her with the air of a man not unwilling to share his troubles. "It's a rare muddle, Miss Marple, and that's the truth of it. Look here." He spread the photographs upon a garden table, weighting their corners against the breeze with smooth stones from the rockery. Footprints from the main entrance, a good number of them, leading in toward the centre, and out again. Footprints from the east gate too, by the kitchen garden, same story. They cross here, and here, and here again. If I didn't know better, I'd say half the county had been traipsing through that maze last night. Miss Marple studied the photographs with great attention, her pale blue eyes moving slowly over the tangled white paths, the dark scattered marks of footprints, crossing and recrossing in a pattern that seemed, at first glance, to mean nothing at all. "How very interesting," she said at last. "Interesting, Miss Marple? I'd call it a proper headache." "Oh, I don't doubt it is that as well, Inspector. But you see—" She paused, considering how best to put the thought that had been forming, slowly and not yet quite completely, since first she had stood at the maze's entrance that morning. "A headache is generally a thing without a cause we can see. But this," she tapped the photograph gently, "this has the look of a thing that was made. Deliberately, I mean. There is a difference, you know, between footprints that simply happened, the way snow simply happens, and footprints that were arranged to look as though they simply happened." Crabbe frowned at the photograph, then at her. "Arranged how?" "I'm not entirely certain yet," Miss Marple admitted, with the particular honesty of a woman who had never found it useful to pretend to more certainty than she possessed. "But I notice, for instance, that the prints near the center of the maze, near poor Mr. Vane himself, are a good deal less confused than the prints nearer the entrances, as though whoever made this great tangle of trails took particular care to muddy the waters at the edges, where one might expect to be seen leaving or arriving, and rather less care in the middle, where, I should think, they did not expect anyone to look quite so closely." "Or," said Crabbe slowly, "the middle's just where the murder happened, and the prints there are simpler because there was less time to make a mess of them." "That is certainly possible," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. "I should not like to say otherwise. But you did ask whether there was any sense to be made of it, Inspector, and I rather think there is, though I confess I have not yet read it properly. A maze, you know, is a curious sort of puzzle. It is built to confuse those who do not know its paths, while remaining perfectly clear and simple to those who do." She straightened, drawing her coat a little closer, and looked once more toward the dark hedges, silent now under their blanket of snow, holding their secret with the patient indifference of a thing that has held secrets for 60 years and seen no particular reason to give them up easily. "I think, Inspector," she said slowly, "that whoever walked through that maze last night knew it very well indeed, well enough to make a great muddle look like chance, and well enough, I shouldn't wonder, to make it look as though the muddle had nothing at all to do with them." Guests under scrutiny. The afternoon brought with it a change in the weather, and, with it, a change in the temper of the house. The thin sun of the morning gave way to a flat, grey sky, and a fine new snow began drifting down once more, soft and steady, as though the heavens themselves were quietly intent on erasing whatever evidence remained. Inspector Crabbe, conscious of this, had given orders that no one was to leave the grounds, and had set himself the task of speaking privately with each guest in the small study off the library, a dim, book-lined room that had, until that morning, been used chiefly by the Colonel for the writing of letters he never seemed in any great hurry to send. Miss Marple was not present for these interviews, of course, but she had a gift, long cultivated, for being quietly in the right places at the right times. In the corridor outside, with her knitting, when a guest emerged looking shaken. In the morning room, pouring tea, when nerves loosened tongues that formal questioning had not. And what she gathered, piece by small piece, over the course of that long grey afternoon, formed a picture a good deal more interesting than Inspector Crabbe's notebook alone could have provided. It was Mrs. Carmody who interested her first, and it was Mrs. Carmody whom she found, quite by chance, weeping quietly in the small conservatory at the rear of the house, where the ferns grew tall and green against the cold glass, and where a woman might reasonably suppose herself unobserved. "Forgive me," Miss Marple said gently, making rather more noise with the door than was strictly necessary, so as not to startle her too badly. "I had hoped to find a quiet corner for my knitting. I shan't disturb you." "No, no, please, stay if you like." Mrs. Carmody dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief already damp through. "I dare say you think me very foolish, crying over a man who treated me so badly. I think nothing of the kind, my dear. Grief is rarely so simple as deserving or not deserving." Something in this seemed to loosen the other woman's reserve, for she said, in a low, unsteady voice, "We were to be married once. Years ago now, Rupert and I. He broke it off very suddenly, for reasons I needn't go into, and I thought myself quite recovered from it, until I saw him again last night and found I was not recovered at all." She laughed, a small, bitter sound. "He still owed Gerald money, you know." "A great deal of it. My brother invested rather foolishly in one of Rupert's schemes some years back, and Rupert never troubled himself to pay it back, though he had ample means to. How distressing for Mr. Finch. More than distressing, it's nearly ruined him. And Rupert found it amusing, I think, dangling the debt over Gerald's head, promising repayment, then finding some new excuse." Mrs. Carmody pressed the handkerchief to her eyes once more. "I don't say my brother killed him, Miss Marple. I should never say such a thing. But I shan't pretend either of us is sorry he's dead." Miss Marple, her needles clicking softly, made no reply beyond a sympathetic murmur, though she filed the information away with care. A broken engagement, an old grievance, and a debt that gave Gerald Finch motive enough, certainly, though motive, she reflected, was very often the least useful piece of any puzzle. Most people who wished someone dead never did anything about it at all. Gerald Finch himself, she found later, in the billiard room, ostensibly practicing shots he was not, in fact, making, his hand unsteady upon the cue. "I suppose Eleanor's told you about the money," he said abruptly, when Miss Marple had settled herself in a chair near the fire, with every appearance of having no particular interest in him at all. "She generally does, when she's upset. Well, it's true enough. Vane owed me £1,100, and I'll not pretend I'm sorry to see the debt die with him, even if I'll never see a penny of it now either. That seems a very unfortunate position to be in, Mr. Finch." "It is rather." He set down the cue with a sigh, sitting heavily upon the edge of the billiard table. "I didn't kill him, Miss Marple, whatever Inspector Crabbe may think when he's finished totting up everyone's grievances. I haven't the stomach for it. I sat up half the night with a headache and a great deal of brandy, and I never left my room. No one can confirm it, more's the pity, but there it is." "Did you know the maze well, Mr. Finch?" He looked at her, faintly surprised by the question. "Not especially. I've walked it once or twice, with the others, on previous visits. Never troubled to learn its tricks, though. Why do you ask?" "Oh, no particular reason," Miss Marple said placidly, returning to her knitting, though she thought it rather telling that he had answered the question honestly enough, without any of the evasion she might have expected from a guilty man. Or, she reminded herself, precisely the answer a clever man might give, if he wished to appear honest. Major Reeve, when she came upon him in the gun-room, cleaning a pair of pistols with the absorbed concentration of a man glad of something to occupy his hands, was rather more forthcoming, in his way, though chiefly on the subject of his own past exploits, several of which, Miss Marple suspected, bore only the loosest relation to fact. "Knew Vane some years back, in fact," he said, polishing a barrel with great vigour. "Card business. Lost a tidy sum to him once, at a club in town. Didn't care for the fellow, if I'm honest, but I shan't pretend I had reason enough to murder him over a few hands of bezique." He set down the pistol, eyeing her shrewdly. "You're wondering whether I know the maze well enough to have done the thing cleverly, I expect. You read my thoughts very accurately, Major. I know it tolerably well. Walked it a good many times, summers past. Never could resist a puzzle, you understand. Military mind, that sort of thing. But knowing the way through a maze and putting a knife in a man's heart are two very different skills, Miss Marple, and I never had much taste for the second, whatever the regiment may have required of me in younger days." It was Julian Hartwell, however, whom Miss Marple found most difficult to draw out, and most curious to observe. She came upon him in the library, ostensibly reading, though she noted the book lay open at the same page for the better part of 20 minutes. "You and Mr. Vane were acquainted before this visit, I think," she said, settling herself nearby with the easy, unthreatening manner of an old woman simply making conversation. Something flickered across his face, there and gone so quickly she might almost have imagined it. "Slightly. We moved in some of the same circles, in town. He seemed, if I may say so, rather pointed in his remarks toward you last evening, at dinner." "Did he?" Hartwell's smile was pleasant, practiced, entirely unrevealing. "Rupert was pointed with everyone, Miss Marple. It was rather his way. And yet I noticed you watching him a good deal, before dinner, in a manner that suggested rather more than passing acquaintance. For just a moment, the smile faltered entirely, and something harder showed beneath it. Gone again, almost before Miss Marple could be certain she had seen it at all. "You're very observant, Miss Marple," he said quietly. "I shouldn't like to think what conclusions a woman like you might draw from watching a man's face too closely. But I assure you, whatever Rupert Vane and I were to one another, it had ended long before last night, and I had no reason on earth to wish him dead. Certainly not enough to risk my own neck over it." He returned to his book with an air of finality that left Miss Marple no further opening, and she did not press him, for she had learned long ago that a thing pressed too soon very often closed up entirely, like a sea anemone touched too roughly, whereas a thing left alone, watched patiently, would very often open of its own accord in time. She gathered her knitting and rose to go, pausing only at the door to glance back at him, still and silent over his unread book, his easy charm folded away somewhere out of sight, like a man keeping careful watch over a door he very much hoped no one else would think to open. Outside, the snow continued falling, soft and silent, covering whatever traces yet remained in the maze below, and Miss Marple, climbing the stairs to dress for an early supper, found herself thinking that of all the small, sharp pieces she had gathered that afternoon, it was the silences, far more than the words, that seemed to matter most. A small mistake supper. That evening was a subdued affair, eaten chiefly in silence, broken only by the Colonel's determined, if unconvincing attempts at ordinary conversation, and the soft, persistent hiss of snow against the windows. Miss Marple ate sparingly, her mind occupied less with the indifferent fish course than with the small collection of facts she had gathered that afternoon, turning them over as one might turn over stones on a beach, looking for the one that did not quite match the others. It was afterward, when the gentlemen had withdrawn to the library and the ladies sat somewhat awkwardly over their coffee in the drawing-room, that Inspector Crabbe sent word he wished to speak with her privately, a courtesy he had begun extending, somewhat to his own surprise, after their previous acquaintance had proved rather more useful to him than his pride entirely cared to admit. She found him in the small study, the Colonel's rough sketch of the maze spread before him once more, alongside the developed photographs, and a list, in his own careful hand, of where each guest claimed to have been the previous night. "I've been thinking on what you said this morning, Miss Marple, about the prints being arranged rather than merely confused." He pushed the photographs toward her. "I had my sergeant measure the stride lengths, where he could make them out clearly enough. Thought it might tell us something about who made which prints. A tall man walks differently from a short one, that sort of thing." "How very sensible, Inspector." "Sensible, perhaps, but it's left me more muddled than before." He tapped one set of measurements. "Here, prints leading from the main entrance toward the center, fairly long stride, evenly spaced. Could be a tall man walking with purpose. Could be a shorter man walking quickly. Could be near enough anyone in this house, if I'm honest, bar perhaps yourself and Mrs. Carmody." Miss Marple studied the photographs with great attention, her eyes moving along the dark, scattered marks in the snow, and felt, as she did so, the first stirring of an idea, not yet fully formed, but with the particular shape of a thing that wanted attention. "Inspector, might I ask, these prints here, the ones you say lead from the main entrance toward the center, do they continue in an unbroken line, or do they stop and start, as it were?" "Unbroken, far as my sergeant could tell, steady pace, right through to near where the body was found. And the prints from the east gate, the kitchen garden entrance, are they of a similar character?" Crabbe consulted his notes. "Similar enough, though there's a deal more confusion round that gate itself. Comings and goings, several different sets, by the look of it, criss-crossing right at the threshold." Miss Marple considered this for a long moment, her needles, for once, entirely still in her lap. An idea had begun to take shape in her mind. A neat, satisfying sort of idea. The kind that arranges a great many troublesome facts into a single tidy explanation, and which therefore, she reflected even as she formed it, ought to be regarded with a certain suspicion, for the tidiest explanations were not always the truest ones. "I wonder, Inspector," she said slowly, "whether the confusion at the East Gate might not be the more important thing to consider. If someone wished to create the appearance that several people had passed in and out that way, to muddy the waters there deliberately, they might have walked back and forth several times themselves, in different directions, before committing to a single clear path toward the center." "That's more or less what I'd begun to think myself," Crabbe admitted. "Question is who? Now, Major Reeve says he never left the library last night, but Pratt mentions clearing a brandy glass from the library this morning that had hardly been touched, which doesn't sit well with a man who claims he sat up half the night drinking it." Miss Marple felt the satisfying click of a thought falling into place. Too satisfying, perhaps, though she did not pause long enough in that moment to heed the small, quiet warning it ought to have carried. "The Major did say he knew the maze tolerably well," she said. "And a soldier's training, Inspector, a habit of deliberate, measured movement, might well account for prints that look purposeful rather than panicked. You think it's Reeve, then?" "I think," said Miss Marple, with rather more confidence than she generally permitted herself at so early a stage, "that it bears looking into a good deal further. The untouched brandy glass is a very curious thing, Inspector. I should ask Pratt more about it, if I were you, and I should ask the Major again, rather more closely, exactly when he says he went up, and whether anyone at all can confirm any part of his evening." Crabbe, who had learned to trust her instincts a good deal more than his own in matters of this kind, nodded and made a note, and Miss Marple, satisfied, went up to bed that night with the comfortable, settled feeling of a puzzle very nearly solved. It was not until the following morning, over a rather poor night's sleep, troubled by half-formed dreams of hedges and footprints, that the small, nagging doubt she had pushed aside the evening before returned to her with rather more force. She found Pratt in the pantry, polishing silver with the slow, careful thoroughness of a man for whom such small tasks were a comfort in troubled times, and asked him, as casually as she was able, about the brandy glass. "Oh, that, miss. I shouldn't have mentioned it, I expect. Only it seemed an odd thing at the time." Pratt set down the spoon he had been polishing. "Major Reeve, you mean? Well, miss, the truth is, I cleared that glass away myself round about 10:30, before I went up. The Major had gone up already by then, said he had a head coming on, and wished an early night. I poured the brandy out when he asked for it earlier in the evening, and he'd barely touched it before he left. I only mentioned it because it seemed wasteful, miss, that's all. Good brandy, and hardly a drop gone." Miss Marple stood very still for a moment, feeling the neat, satisfying shape of her idea from the night before crumble rather quietly away. "Pratt, you mean to say the Major retired before 10:30? Not, as he told the inspector, sometime after midnight?" "That's right, miss. I remember it clear enough, on account of the clock striking the half-hour just as I came through with the tray." She thanked him and withdrew, feeling, not for the first time in a long career of such small humiliations, the particular discomfort of having built a tidy theory upon a foundation that had simply not been there. She had heard untouched brandy glass and claims he sat up late, and had, with the eagerness of a woman fond of a clean solution, assembled them into a picture of a man lying about his evening to conceal a walk through the snow, when in fact the far simpler truth was that the Major had told a small, vain lie of an entirely different and rather more pathetic kind, claiming to have sat up drinking and reminiscing, when in truth he had gone to bed early with a headache, too proud, perhaps, to admit to such an ordinary, undramatic frailty in company. It was, she reflected, settling herself in the morning room with her knitting and a cup of tea gone rather cooler than she liked, a useful sort of mistake to have made, for it reminded her, as such mistakes occasionally needed to, that the mind was a great deal too fond of tidy answers, and that a fact which fit beautifully into the shape one already suspected ought to be examined rather more carefully, not less, precisely because it fit so well. She would have to begin again, she thought, with rather more humility than she had permitted herself the evening before. The Major's lie, small and vain as it was, told her something useful, certainly. That people in this house were keeping secrets that had nothing whatever to do with murder, which made the business of separating the relevant secrets from the irrelevant ones a good deal more delicate than she had first supposed. She found Inspector Crabbe in the hall, about to set off for the maze once more, and caught his arm gently before he could go. "Inspector, I owe you a small correction. I believe I led you rather astray last night, regarding Major Reeve." Crabbe raised an eyebrow, but listened patiently as she explained, and had the grace, when she had finished, to look more amused than irritated. "Well, Miss Marple, I shan't pretend I'm not relieved. The Major's an old fool by the sound of it, but I'd hate to think a man's vanity over a brandy glass was the thing that hanged him." He folded his notebook closed. "Back to the beginning, then." "Not quite the beginning, Inspector," Miss Marple said, with a small, rueful smile, "but certainly a step or two back from where I had got to. I find that no bad thing, on the whole. It is generally the second look at a puzzle, rather than the first confident one, that sees it properly." The maze remembers. The snow had stopped again by mid-morning, and a pale, watery light lay over Ashcombe Hall's gardens as Miss Marple, wrapped warmly against the cold, made her way down to the maze itself, determined this time to see its puzzle not through photographs and second-hand measurements, but with her own eyes, walking its paths, as the killer himself must have walked them 2 nights before. Inspector Crabbe, whom she found already there, conferring with his sergeant over a fresh dusting of snow that had settled lightly over the old footprints, blurring their edges but not, fortunately, erasing them entirely, greeted her with the air of a man glad of company in an unrewarding task. "I've had the Colonel's plan copied out proper," he said, producing a clean sheet upon which the maze's winding paths had been carefully redrawn. "Thought it might help to walk it ourselves, see how the thing actually works, rather than puzzling over it from outside." "An excellent idea, Inspector. But I confess I had been thinking along similar lines myself." They entered together, the Colonel's plan in Crabbe's hand, and Miss Marple found herself, for the first time, truly inside the maze. Its hedges rising tall and dark on either side, the narrow path winding ahead in a manner that gave no clue whatever as to what lay beyond the next turning. It was, she thought, a remarkably disorienting thing, even with a map in hand. She could well imagine how confusing it must seem to one who had only the vaguest sense of its shape.
"Here's where the body was found," Crabbe said, some minutes later, as they reached the spot, now marked only by a faint discoloration in the snow, the rest having been carefully disturbed by police boots in the course of their work.
"And here," he consulted the plan, "is the central clearing, with the sundial. Not 20 yards further on." Miss Marple stood a moment, looking from the spot where Vane had fallen to the clearing beyond, and then back the way they had come, turning the Colonel's plan slowly in her gloved hands. "Inspector, I wonder, might we walk the path from the east gate, the one by the kitchen garden?" They retraced their steps and found the smaller entrance, half hidden behind a stand of yews, and began again, following the path it offered. Miss Marple noted, as they went, that this route to the centre was considerably shorter and more direct than the one from the main entrance. Fewer false turnings, fewer of the maze's deliberately confusing branches. "How curious," she murmured, half to herself. "What's curious, Miss Marple?" "Only that the east gate offers a far simpler route to the centre than the main entrance does. A person entering by the main gate, not knowing the maze well, might wander for the better part of an hour before stumbling upon the right path. But the east gate," she gestured at the path ahead, which ran, with only 2 modest turnings, almost directly to the clearing. "The east gate all but leads one by the hand. You think our murderer came in this way then? Knew the short route?" "I think it very likely, Inspector, that whoever killed Mr. Vane knew this maze a great deal better than they allowed anyone to suppose. But I think also," and here Miss Marple paused, frowning slightly, turning the Colonel's plan once more, "that the confusion at the main entrance was not merely an accident of many feet passing through. I believe it was made on purpose by someone who understood that the police, finding such a tangle there, would assume the murderer had entered by the more obvious route, and would spend their efforts untangling a riddle that had, in truth, very little to do with the murder at all." Crabbe looked at her sharply. "A false trail. laid deliberately. I believe so, yes. Consider, Inspector, if you wished to disguise the fact that you knew this maze intimately, what better way than to create a great mess of confused footprints at the entrance everyone would naturally suspect, while slipping in quietly and almost unnoticed by the gate that offered the shortest and simplest path. The very simplicity of the East Gate route is what allowed it to be overlooked. We have all been so dazzled by the muddle at the main entrance that we gave the cleaner trail here scarcely a thought. They walked on in silence to the central clearing, where the old stone sundial stood, its face dusted with snow, casting no shadow under the flat grey sky. Miss Marple stood beside it a long moment, looking back the way they had come, and then toward the path that led onward, deeper into the maze's far side. There is something else, Inspector, that has been troubling me rather. We have spoken a great deal of who might have wished Mr. Vane dead, and there were several, as you know, with grievance enough. But we have spoken rather less of who, among them, could be trusted to know this maze so well as to use it in such a deliberate fashion. The Colonel knows it best of all, by his own admission, but he had no quarrel with Vane that I have heard of. Major Reeve claims familiarity, though I confess I trust little that the Major claims about himself. Letitia knows it well, having grown up here. And… She stopped. And? Crabbe prompted. And I have been remiss, Inspector, in not asking more closely whether anyone outside the obvious circle of suspects might have had occasion, in years past, to learn this maze's secrets rather better than they have let on. I find I have been thinking of this puzzle rather too much as a matter of motive. Who hated Mr. Vane enough, and not quite enough as a matter of opportunity in its truest sense? Who, of all these people, possessed the particular, unusual knowledge that this crime required? She fell silent, turning this thought over with the careful, patient attention she gave to all such turnings, and found herself recalling, with sudden and uncomfortable clarity, a small remark made 2 evenings before, at dinner, that she had let pass with too little notice at the time. Mazes are rather like people, don't you find, Colonel? Vane had said, with that careless, knowing charm of his. All those false turnings, dead ends, blind corners, and somewhere in the middle, if you're patient enough, the truth. It had seemed, at the time, only an idle remark, a clever man's clever observation, offered to fill a silence. But Miss Marple, standing now in the very centre of the maze he had spoken of, found herself wondering whether Mr. Vane, with the particular cruelty of a man who enjoyed watching others squirm, had not been saying something rather more pointed than anyone in that drawing-room had cared to admit, and whether someone present had understood his meaning a great deal more clearly than the rest. "Inspector," she said slowly, "I think I should like to speak with Letitia Ashcombe again. And I think, too, that we ought to ask the Colonel a rather more particular question, not about who knows the maze well, but about who, in years past, might have spent rather more time in it than anyone here has troubled to mention." Crabbe folded the plan and tucked it beneath his arm. "You've thought of something, Miss Marple." "I have thought of a great many things, Inspector, over these past 2 days, and I am sorry to say that not all of them have proved sound. But this one, I think—" She looked once more toward the dark, silent hedges surrounding them, holding their shape against the grey winter sky, exactly as they had held it for 60 years. "This one, I begin to believe, may very well be the truth the maze has been keeping." The reveal. The Colonel, when Miss Marple put her question to him that afternoon, looked briefly puzzled, then thoughtful, then distinctly uncomfortable. The expression of a man whose natural hospitality was at war with an unwelcome memory. "Julian Hartwell," he repeated, turning the name over as though feeling for something sharp concealed inside it. "Well, yes, as a matter of fact. He visited here once before, several years back. Summer party, 4 or 5 years ago now, I should think. Came as someone's guest. Letitia's, I believe, or perhaps young Davies's acquaintance at the time. Stayed the better part of a fortnight." "And the maze, Colonel?" The Colonel's moustache shifted in a faint frown of recollection. "Now that you mention it, yes. Young Hartwell was rather taken with it, I remember. Spent a good deal of time out there, in the afternoons especially. Said he had a passion for puzzles. I showed him the plan once, rather proud of it, you understand. And he'd studied it with the sort of attention most young men reserve for things a good deal more interesting than old Hedges. He paused. Dashed clever, I thought him then. Remembered things. The kind of mind that doesn't let things go. No, said Miss Marple softly. I don't imagine it does. She found Inspector Crabbe in the hall, pulling on his coat, and told him what the Colonel had said. She watched his face settle from mild interest to something considerably more attentive. He told us he barely knew the place, Crabbe said flatly. Said he'd walked it once or twice on previous visits, didn't know its tricks. Yes, said Miss Marple. He did say that, rather particularly I thought at the time. It was one of those answers that has the shape of honesty without quite committing to its substance. He said he had never troubled to learn its tricks, which is not, strictly speaking, the same as never having learnt them. Crabbe was quiet a moment, his jaw set with the particular determination of a policeman who has been patient a long while and now sees the reason for it. I'll want to speak to him again. Yes, said Miss Marple. I think you will. Though, Inspector, I wonder whether it might not be more useful, before you do, to discover what it was precisely between Hartwell and Mr. Vane. Something was said at dinner the first evening that I have been turning over ever since, and I believe there is a connection there we have not yet properly traced. I should like, if you'll permit me, to speak to Letitia first. I rather think she knows more than she has said. She found Letitia in her sitting room, a small fire burning low, a book open and unread upon her lap. A mirror, Miss Marple thought, of Julian Hartwell 2 days before, though the expression on Letitia's face was less carefully composed, and showed rather more of the strain she had been carrying.
Letitia, my dear, Miss Marple said, seating herself with the gentle purposefulness of a woman who intended to stay. I think you know something about Mr. Hartwell and Mr. Vane, and I think you have been keeping it to yourself because you believe it makes matters look worse for Julian than they perhaps are. I understand that impulse entirely, but I am afraid the time for protecting people from unpleasantness has rather passed, and what is needed now is the truth, even if it is an uncomfortable one. Letitia stared at her for a long moment, then looked away, out toward the window and the grey, still garden beyond. They had a business arrangement, years ago, she said at last, in a low, careful voice. Julian invested in one of Vane's schemes. This was before I knew Julian at all, you understand, before he came here that summer. It went badly, very badly, but that was not the worst of it. She paused, pressing her hands together. Vane knew something about Julian's past, something personal, something that would have been ruinous, Miss Marple, if it had come out. And Vane had been using it, for years. Small demands, irregular, but never quite enough to bring things to a crisis. Just enough to keep Julian manageable. Blackmail, Miss Marple said, very quietly. I never heard Julian call it that, but yes, I think that is what it was. And Mr. Vane, his remark at dinner about mazes and their false turnings, and the truth at the centre, you believe that was directed at Julian? Letitia's hands tightened. I was certain of it. The way Julian looked, just for a second, I had never seen him look quite like that before, and then his face went smooth again, the way it does, and he smiled, and I told myself I was imagining things. You were not imagining things, Miss Marple said gently. You are, I think, a great deal more observant than you give yourself credit for. Thank you, my dear. I know that was not easy. What followed, in the small study that had served as Inspector Crabbe's interview room for the better part of 2 days, had the quiet, almost inevitable quality of a thing that has been building toward its moment for a long while, and knows it at last. Julian Hartwell entered with his customary composure, his pleasant face arranged in its familiar expression of mild, cooperative attention. He took his seat. He accepted the offer of tea that Crabbe did not in fact make. He smiled. Mr. Hartwell, Miss Marple said, from her chair in the corner, for Crabbe had permitted her presence, with the resigned grace of a man who had long since stopped pretending she wasn't part of the process. I wonder if you would tell us about the fortnight you spent at Ashcombe Hall
in the summer of 1950. The smile remained in place for precisely one beat too long, and then, very quietly, it went out, like a lamp turned down rather than blown out. And what was left behind was something a good deal older and tireder than the face that usually wore it. "The Colonel told you," he said. "It was not a question. The Colonel told me. As he told me how carefully you studied the plan of his maze, and how often you walked it during those summer afternoons. You know this maze as well as anyone alive, Mr. Hartwell. Better than Letitia, I should think, for she knows it as a child knows a familiar garden, without the particular attention of a man memorizing something for a purpose." Hartwell looked at his hands. "I knew, even then," he said slowly, "that Vane was the sort of man one might need to outmaneuver one day. He'd made that clear enough. And I have, as the Colonel apparently noted, the sort of mind that keeps things." "So you kept the maze," said Miss Marple, "against a day you hoped would never come." "Against a day I was afraid would come." He looked up at her then, and his expression was not what she might have expected. Not defiant, not calculating, but simply exhausted, with the deep, settled exhaustion of a man who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time. "He came here on purpose, you know. Vane. He wasn't invited. He persuaded the Colonel through a mutual friend, arranged the whole thing. He rang me a week before and told me he would be here. Told me he thought a house party would be a pleasant occasion to review our arrangement. He wanted more, a great deal more, a brief, humorless breath. I had been paying him for 6 years. And so you decided," Inspector Crabbe said, his voice level, "to put a stop to it." "I decided." Hartwell stopped, began again. "I went to speak with him, that night. Only to speak. I want you to believe that, though I understand if you don't. I found him in the maze. He'd gone in after dinner, sent me a note to meet him there. Said the snow was romantic, the sort of thing he found amusing. He told me his new figure, standing there in the dark, in the snow, smiling the way he always smiled when he had you cornered. He was quiet for a long moment. I had the knife because I had been afraid, for weeks, of what he might do. I had not decided anything, and then I had. The room was very still. I walked the maze's confusing paths afterward, he said. The ones I had spent that summer learning, back and forth, in and out, from one entrance to the other. I remembered every turning. Something in his voice was almost wondering at itself. It had been 5 years. I still remembered every turning. The mind that does not let things go, Miss Marple said softly, more to herself than to anyone. Hartwell looked at her with something that was almost, in another set of circumstances, wry appreciation. Quite so, Miss Marple. Quite so. Inspector Crabbe rose and said the necessary words in the quiet, formal manner of a man who had said them before and found no easier way of saying them, and Julian Hartwell rose also and went with him without protest, with the composure of a man who had, perhaps, been expecting this moment long enough that its arrival was more relief than dread. Miss Marple remained in her chair a while after they had gone, her knitting in her hands but her needles still, watching the pale winter light shift slowly across the Colonel's bookshelves, and the draught move the curtain, and the fire settle quietly into itself. She thought of the maze, standing cold and patient outside under its snow, its paths unchanged, its turnings exactly where they had always been, indifferent to the use that had been made of them, as old things generally were. She thought of Rupert Vane, who had spent 6 years tightening a rope around a man, and found it impossible to imagine the rope might one day be turned upon himself. She thought of Julian Hartwell, who had memorized a maze on a summer afternoon 5 years ago, for reasons he could not quite have named, and who had walked its paths in the dark and snow with the perfect recall of a man who had never, in his life, allowed himself to forget anything that might one day matter. And she thought, with the particular, quiet sadness that had never left her in all the years she had spent watching human nature reveal itself in its least flattering lights, that very little of it was truly surprising. Only, as always, deeply, irreducibly sad. She rose at last, set aside her knitting, and went to find Letitia, who would need, she thought, a great deal of ordinary human company and very little talk of mazes, or of men who walked in them at night, or of the cold patience of snow that covered everything and preserved everything and waited, without judgment, for the morning to come and reveal what lay beneath. Outside, the last light faded from the gardens of Ashcombe Hall, and the old yew maze stood quiet in the early dark, its paths already filling softly once more with new snow, covering the footprints, covering the trails, covering everything, as snow, in the end, always does.